بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أولياءك في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين يا رب العالمين. صل وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين آمين يا رب العالمين. Okay. So anyone wishing to install a new system of rule needs to overcome opposition. This likewise applies to the neoliberal system of rule. And an establishing power is needed in order to set up a new An establishing power is needed in order to set up a new system of rule, and this often entails violence. So, agent of change is talking about. That establishing power is not, however, identical with the power that stabilizes the system on the inside. So, the internal strength of a system and its mechanism must be differentiated from the mechanism through which a system is installed or brought into being. I think that's what he's saying. So that would be a revolution or change, and this would be a functioning of a system after that change. So it is well known that's a good distinction. It is a well known fact that Margaret Thatcher, as the trailblazer of neoliberalism, treated the trade union as enemy within. Well, it's not right. Enemy within, and use violence to fight them. But labor unions were limits on the freedom of capital. Okay, so that limits needed to be transcended at a specific time in history due to the internal needs of capital and its mechanisms, and the way it could accumulate at a maximum level at that point in history. So it is a well-known fact that Margaret Thatcher, as a trailblazer of neoliberalism, treated the trade union as the enemy within and used violence to fight them. However, violent intervention to assert the neoliberal agenda must not be confused with the power that maintains the system. That's the positive power for system itself. So let's talk a bit about this. So in order to understand revolution, any fundamental change, we need to have some sort of a theory of change. How does change occurs? And type of changes, I guess. And change within system, change from outside the system, and even within system you can have a fundamental change and ordinary change, I guess. So fundamental change can be, termed as a revolution within a system, I guess. And this is, real revolution in the sense as one system is replaced by another system. So how does the change occur? So he's pointing to something fundamental here, but although I think is missing something fundamental, so we'll look at that. So let's see what he's talking about first, and then you have to add something to it to that. So he's making this distinction between installing a system, a new system of rule, obviously in place of a already existing system of rules. So before neoliberalism you had what we can call welfare capitalism or social democratic capitalism, in which capital was a partner with the state and labor unions. So this is still capitalism, but there's a limit on the working of capitalism. It has to work with other partners. But the neoliberal system can be described as the moment when capital actually captures the state and then overwhelm the labor union in its power, and basically put huge limits on it and disintegrate it, or and make it subservient to the logic of capital. So that's a neoliberal system. So that's a system which was installed. So what were we talking about? Distinction between installing a new system, and then once that new system is installed, how that new system works. That's the distinction he's making, and I think that's a valid distinction. The basic distinction between how a system is installed, and that requires a process which may take decades and centuries, and an event when this actually happens, and that event can be violent, and the process can be violent as well. Um, but there's another thing, which is once that system has come into existence, how it works. That's what I'm saying. Now, how it works will depend on, obviously, after it is installed, it can also continue to face resistance from the erstwhile system and remnants of the erstwhile system. But that depends on the strength of the revolution, etc. But once it has established, how it works is different. You need internal mechanism, internal rationality, and its internalization by critical mass of elite, etc. So these are two different. So installation of neoliberalism might have accompanied by violence, and also its early phase might have been um, accompanied by violence or repression of some sort. But obviously, that violence and repression is faced only by those people who are opposing that system. There are always a lot of people who are for the new system, so they are not experiencing that violence and repression. Um, and once a new system is stabilized, then how it works is different. How that there are people who are still going to face repression and all that, but once the system has strengthened, it doesn't need to repress, use violence as much as or it had to use when it came into being, because its internal strength allows it to, firstly the opposition has weakened, secondly it has a strength in itself and it has power, so now it can allow some form of managed opposition, etc. It doesn't have to use naked repression that often or that much. That will vary, obviously, empirically, depending on the strength of a system, its modus operandi, and all those things. Okay, so let's read it again. Anyone wishing to install a new system rule needs to overcome opposition. This likewise applies to the neoliberal system of rule, and establishing power is needed in order to set up a new system of rule, and this often entails violence. That establishing power is not, however, that establishing power, however, is not identical with power that stabilizes it, internal power of a system, the system of the inside, on the inside. That will depend on its internal mechanism as well as inculcation of a new rationality among new, cadre of elite, for example. Okay, so identical with the power that stabilizes the system from the, it is well known fact that Margaret Thatcher, as the tailblazer of neoliberalism, treated the trade union as the enemy within and used violence to fight them. However, violent interventions to assert the neoliberal agenda must not be confused with the power that maintains the system once it has been established. So that distinction, despite some underhanded sleight of hand, which will become clear in the next paragraph, I think that distinction is valid. I think, and it's important. The power maintaining the system in disciplinary and industrial society relied on repression. Now, he's assuming that neoliberal system is not disciplinary, which is not to say that it is only disciplinary, but um, disciplinary aspect is there or still. It hasn't gone away because neoliberal revolution, if we can call it a revolution, was a revolution within capitalist system. So it didn't overthrow all that was there in the capitalist system at the time. So it takes from neoliberal system, and we also should remember that there are two types of neoliberal. There are two types. They exist, alongside each other. Two types of neoliberalism. The Thatcherite, Reaganite, right-wing neoliberalism, and Blairite, Clintonite, a left-wing neoliberalism. And their modus operandi are slightly different. In both systems, they don't throw away everything from the previous social democratic system. They build on it. And they get rid of some of the elements of the welfare system, but not all of it, because the rationality remains the same. Rationality remains the same, and the rationality of accumulation for the sake of accumulation, and also the subjectivity remains the same in a sense. Education system remains intact, and all other institutions remain intact. That is a new arrangement or a rearrangement of a already existing set of rules in a sense. So he's, I think, exaggerating the break. So disciplinary techniques are still there, because the thing with disciplinary techniques is, as for example Foucault has, and among others, Foucault has demonstrated or described, disciplines can be lifted or external disciplines can be lifted to the extent that those disciplinary rationalities and techniques are internalized, because even in earlier systems, the main thing is self-discipline, not because you can't run a system based on repression alone, and especially capitalism. So repression and discipline relies on internalization of self-discipline by a large sector of population. So the power maintaining system relied on repression, and wasn't just repression, obviously. There was also rewards, etc. as time went by. That was the whole raison d'etre of welfare system. So factory workers were brutally exploited by factory owners. But then obviously those same factory workers became, especially in the mature capitalism, partners in running the system. And the whole point of the neoliberal system was that the trade unions become too strong vis-a-vis capitals, and the requirements of the accumulation of capital change radically. So that required weakening of trade unions, etc. But also, it wasn't just they weakened not just from external repression, but they also weakened internally, in the sense that because a lot of workers were able to get basic rights, etc., they were no longer repressed and deprived in a way in which, for example, 19th century and early 20th century workers were. So it was so capital was able to overwhelm trade unions to a large extent because its workers were no longer deprived anymore, for example. So they were able to side with capital or remain neutral in this struggle. So it's not just repression in the early system and no repression in the later system. There's repression in both systems, but repression is needed only to the extent opposition is strong and is directed towards the opposition. You don't need to direct disciplinary repression on a segment of population which has actually internalized it. You know what I mean? Anyway, I think we'll stop here and we'll continue from this inshallah in the next session. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. وصلي وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا